Thank you, Grant, and good day, everyone. We're going to cover a fair bit of ground this afternoon, talking about education and the labor force. And I've broken up the presentation into two parts. We'll look at some basic indicators of both education and labor force, look a little bit at the returns to education, and then in part two, we'll have a look at three groups that are often of interest: the immigrants, the racialized groups, and our Indigenous population. And for each, we'll be able to look at both their education and their labor market experience. First of all, to start off with education, there are four key indicators in the data. First is the highest level of schooling completed. And notice that it's a completion of a level of education that's important. In some of the surveys, people are often asked about whether they attended a certain level. Did you attend university, for example? But in the census, it's measuring completed degrees or diplomas. Then we'll look at what people have studied. What are their experience in terms of their major field of study? Thirdly, we'll look at the location of the highest degree or diploma. What province was that obtained in, or was it obtained in a different country? And finally, there's a question on school attendance in the school year before the census. We're not going to touch on that question in this presentation, but it's certainly in the release data. So let's look at the big picture in terms of the highest level of schooling of the population. And here I've compared the fairly detailed breakdown of levels of education and looked at what's happened in the last 15 years from 2006 to 2021. We look at what's the situation is today. About 2/3 of the working age population, 25 to 64, has a post-secondary degree or diploma. And if we look at what's happened over time, you can see fairly large increases for the bachelor's degree and levels above the bachelor's degree. In 2006, for example, something like 23% of the population had a bachelor's degree or higher, and that now is up around 33%. So some major increases. Not much of a change at the college level. The apprentice certificate programs sort of been up and down, and the non-apprentice trades has been on the decline a little bit. And we'll have a look at the trades a little bit later, certainly important for our labor market. Pretty much stable numbers for secondary school, and the no certificate has come down. That's mainly essentially an effect of our aging population. StatsCan reported that Canada has the highest level of post-secondary education. You can see here 57.5% of the population with a post-secondary degree or diploma. Very difficult to make international comparisons. Some controversy over whether actually the statement that we're the highest is true or not. But however, if we go and look at higher levels of education, I think we get a better picture of where we stand. If we look at bachelor's and higher degrees, Canada is actually in the middle of the pack, fourth after the UK, US, and Japan. And if we look at graduate degrees, we're actually at the bottom of the G7 with a level of about 9.3%, and all other G7 countries are 13 to 15%. So we need to be careful in making international comparisons. Let's look at the change over time by gender. And here is a big story, of course, as you're probably well aware. It's women who have made by far the biggest progress in increasing their levels of education. Back in 2006, both men and women were about equal in terms of post-secondary education, both coming in at around 60%. If you look today, women have really pulled ahead. 70% of women now have a post-secondary degree or diploma compared to about 64% of their brothers. So a major difference. And you can see major difference at the university level and at the college level. At the trades level, certainly men still dominate. Another view on the change over time we can get by comparing generations. At one extreme, we have the population that's just older than the boomer population, sometimes called the pre-boomers. And you can see then, on average, about 40% of that population had a degree or diploma. At the other extreme, the young millennials, some of them Gen Zs, are now up around 70%. So a major change, really a doubling in terms of the level of education. And of course, you can see the gender switch over. For the oldest generations, males had a little higher numbers. They about equalized for that population 55 to 64. That's the back half of the baby boomers. And then women become more numerous for younger age groups. If we look across the country, we can see that it's actually the Quebec CMAs that have the highest level of post-secondary education. And the main reason for that is the CEGEP program in Quebec, which is quite different from other provinces. And many people are in a CEGEP for a couple of years or so, and you can see the high numbers. If you were to look at just university education, we can see Ottawa-Gatineau, Vancouver, and Toronto all having over 40% of their population with university degrees compared to about 30% for the country as a whole. Let's now look at fields of study. What kinds of credentials in terms of fields of study do people have? First of all, just a word on how field of study is measured. It's classified according to something called the Classification of Institutional Programs, or CIP, which has been in existence for some time, but gets updated and has been updated for the 2021 census. It's a hierarchical classification, like most of the classifications. We'll look at a few others later. 12 major groups get broken down into 51 two-digit groups, and then they get further broken down to over 400 minor groups. And just as an example, one of the major groups is business management and public admin. Under that, a two-digit group is business management, marketing, and related support services. And under that, a number of specific minor groups down to including marketing. In the math computer area, same type, big major group, computer information sciences and support services. And you can see broken down minor groups under that. There's another classification that's used and that can be very useful, a much more condensed classification, something called the STEM and non-STEM classification. STEM standing for science, technology, engineering, and math, and the non-STEM being all others, business, humanities, health, arts, etc. And you can see the STEM groups. There are three major groups: science, engineering, and math. And the math gets further broken down into math and computer sciences. The non-STEM groups, an example being business and admin, that gets broken down into business and public admin. So you can see the various detail, a tremendous amount of detail in the census. We look at the big picture, the major groups, we can see the numbers. The two big groups are business management and public admin, 3.7 million people, and the engineering architecture related 3.5 million. Together, they account for about 40%. And you can see health in at about 2.5 million, social sciences at about 2 million, smaller numbers down to the smallest group being agriculture, natural resources at a little over 400,000. Interesting to look at the gender break on each of the major groups. At the top, education, health, social, dominated mostly by women, 70 to 80% women in those. And at the other end, men dominate in the math, engineering fields. I think something that's fairly well known. We look at young people. What are young people studying today? Well, for men, the two top categories are the engineering architecture category, close to 600,000, and the business management at about 300,000. For women, the top is business management, about equal numbers in the health and related fields, about 400,000 each, and in social sciences, about 300,000. Interesting when you look at education, that's fourth, 122,000 women, but it's actually at the bottom of the list for men, only 27,000. Let's turn our attention now to the labor force. What's been happening with our labor force? And here there are a number of different measures that we can look at. One is the labor force status. Are you employed, unemployed, or not active in the labor force? The class of worker. Are you an employee or are you self-employed? And this time we have a bit of new data, and it breaks down employees into permanent and temporary, and actually breaks down the temporary into fixed contracts and casual workers. So an important addition, I think, to the census. Work activity during 2020. Did you work for the full year? Did you work part year? Did you work full time? Did you work part time? That's an important variable when we look at income. We have industry and occupation, which we'll come back to and talk about classifications of each. We have a new question on the main reason for working part-time. Why was it that you were working part-time? Was it your preference? Was it you couldn't find a full-time job? Was it that you're doing caretaking work of either children or seniors and could only work part-time? So some interesting data there. And finally, place of work. Is your usual place of work at home, outside Canada? You don't have a fixed place, you move around from day to day, or is it usually in an office or factory? And of course, the pandemic has had a major effect, and we'll have a look at that on the place of work data. How fast is the labor force growing? And you can see here, going back to 1986 to 91, the growth in our labor force. And the pattern that's clear is that over the last 20 years, we've had a declining rate of growth, 7.4% back in 2001 to 2006, and in the recent period, 3.4%. And the reason for that decline is mainly the aging of our population. As our population gets older, we have more people leaving the labor force than entering, and the growth of the labor force comes down. And actually, it's only been as high as it has been because of the fairly high intake we do with our immigrant population. For the most recent period, the 3.4% was probably pushed down a little bit in the pandemic, but as you can see, the long-term trend is still there due to aging. We look at the actual numbers. You can see the employment numbers in the census increasing, got up to a little over 17 million, basically flattened out compared to 2016. The employment rate actually declined a little bit. That's the aging effect. And the unemployed rate bounced around and was up around 10%. Again, certainly pandemic-related level. And we can look at that by looking at labor force survey data, which of course measures our labor force on a monthly basis. And if we go back to the census in 2016, we can see up until the pandemic, employment numbers were pretty stable. Unemployment rate was pretty stable, a little bit of a decline. And then when the pandemic hit, big increase in unemployment, decrease in employment, and then things started to improve. The employment numbers have drifted up since the census was taken, and the last labor force survey showed our employment numbers now just about at 20 million, certainly higher than the pre-pandemic, and our unemployment numbers were down to what is a record low of about 5.1%. Those are the November numbers that were released just a week or two ago. We've talked about the aging population, the aging labor force. Interesting when you break up our labor force into 10-year age groups, the highest being 55 and over, pretty much equal numbers at each of the groups, except for the youth population, 15 to 24, just over 20%. So pretty stable in size in terms of our labor force. And that has some implications for going forward. We look at growth. We see the growth of the labor force by age pretty much reflects the growth of our population by age. Big increases for the 65 and over population, decreases for that smaller Gen X population in their 40s and early 50s, and their children in the teenage years. declining a bit. And of course, that decline at that 15 to 24-year old age group is one of the reasons many retailers, fast food chains have a real difficulty today attracting young people into their workforce, the real shortage of work, partly due to the fact that that cohort is simply a small cohort. And you can see in terms of the age of our labor force, increasing census over census, heading up to nearly a quarter of our workforce now being over the age of 55, double what it was 20 years ago. If we look at what's happened to the labor force in terms of full year of employment, we can see that in the census, which measures the full year in 2020, about a third of the population actually worked full-time for the full year. And that was about the same as it was 5 years earlier. Fewer people, about 30%, worked part-time, part-year, and more were not active in the labor force at all for the year. And those changes, I think, pretty much reflect the impact the pandemic has had. If we look at that by age, we see probably what we would expect across the age groups. At young ages, very few working full-time, full year, many more working on a part-time, part-year basis. In the core labor market ages, you get up into your 30s and 40s, about half, a little over half the population working full-time, full year, and about 16% or so not active in the paid labor force. And as the older ages, as retirement sets in, smaller numbers working full-time, full year. Interesting for that 65 and over population, we've known there's been delays in retirement, a little under 18%, or a little over 18% of our population, 65 and over, were working at some point, about 2/3 of them working for part year or a part-time. And you can see the trends in what's happened to seniors' labor force. It's been on the rise since the mid-90s. Increasing numbers have delayed their retirement, gone back to work, perhaps into a second job, but you can see the pandemic knocked that down. That trend that was heading upward was pulled back in 2020. And one of the issues going forward was whether that'll bounce back or not, whether people who decided to retire, not take on a second job, to retire a bit earlier, whether that's going to continue. And the decisions of our seniors are important in terms of our labor force growth. They form a significant part of contributing to keeping our labor force growing. We look at the class of workers. Here you can see about 70% of both men and women working as permanent employees, 13 to 15% working as temporary employees, and the self-employed numbers are about 17% for men and about 12% for women. And if we look at the pattern by age, we can see at younger ages, no surprise, permanent employees are at lower levels. And at the oldest age group, 65 and over, permanent employees being higher for women than for men, self-employed being considerably higher for men than women. You can see the 30 to 40% of those who are working at older ages are working as self-employed. Many of them, for example, as consultants in a second job or other kinds of occupations like that. Let's have a look at industry, an important way of understanding our labor force. Many changes in our industrial structure over time, mainly the decline of manufacturing and the increase of our service sector. The classification of industries is very detailed and is done by something called the NAICS code. That stands for North American Industrial Classification System, a system long used and has been developed jointly with the US and Mexico. So it's a North American classification, very detailed. At the major level has 20 sectors, and at the most detailed level has over 700 industries in the harmonized version. And here in Canada, we actually break out some of the detailed industries for our own internal Canadian purposes, and we have a total of over 900 what we'll call Canadian industries. It's just an example of the NAICS classification. A major group being retail trade gets broken down into, for example, food beverage stores, which further gets broken down into grocery stores, specialty food stores, beer, wine stores. The healthcare area, major group being healthcare, social assistance. Under that, a subgroup, ambulatory healthcare services. 7 subgroups under that. I've just shown you 3 of them here. Physicians, medical and diagnostic labs, and home healthcare services. So you can see a very detailed look at how our industrial structure is made up. If we look at the major groups, we can see the largest being healthcare and social assistance at nearly 2.5 million employees. The retail trade not far behind at over 2 million, followed by professional, scientific, technical, manufacturing, construction, education, all in and about 1.5 million. Altogether, over 19 million people reported their industry. If we look at how things have changed since the last census, we can see the big growth being in the professional, scientific, technical area, and also high growth in the healthcare, social assistance, transportation, under that, utilities and construction. At the other extreme, we see declines in areas such as arts and entertainment, wholesale trade, mining area, and accommodation and food services. And certainly some of those declines at the bottom end are a direct result of the pandemic. If you look at the more recent labor force survey, some of those industries have come back and are approaching, if not have exceeded, their pre-pandemic levels. What about occupations? Certainly always of interest in what people do, how much they're making. Let's have a look at that. In terms of the coding of occupation, it's coded by something called the National Occupation Code, been in existence for some time, but saw a major revamp in 2021. One of the features of the occupation, the old NOC code, was that had built in an indicator of skill level, which was useful in looking at, for example, are people being overqualified in their job? It was a okay skill level measure, but it had a lot of issues with it. And it was really revamped for 2021, and I'll show you that in a minute. Going back to the NOC category itself, again, very detailed, 5 structures, the broad categories being 10 groups, and at the very detailed level, over 500 individual groups, occupation groups. Just as an example, big group, natural applied sciences and related occupations, broken down into professional occupations, broken down further into applied sciences, further into computer information, broken down further into database analysts. So you can see how it gets finer and finer. An example in the trades at the big level, technical trades and transportation, and at the detail level down to the level of plumbers, electricians, etc. This chart here now shows the results based on the TEER categorization that I mentioned earlier. There are 6 categories. Management is on its own. And then there are categories 1 through 5, which I've labeled here as needing a university degree, a secondary program of 2 to 3 years, post-secondary program of less than 2 years, completion of secondary school, or category 5 doesn't require any formal education requirements. Now, although I've labeled the various categories essentially by highest level of schooling, in reality, the categories are a little more flexible than that, and they do recognize factors other than the education level, things like experience, supervision, significant safety related, for example, fire persons, length of apprentice training. And so the categories are a little broader than just highest level of education. And we can look at the next slide, which shows the top occupations in terms of how big are the occupation groups. The retail salespersons at the top by a fair margin, over 700,000 people working in that occupation, followed by food counter attendants and related, cashiers, retail wholesale trade managers. If you look down the list, interesting that only 4 of these dozen or so categories really have employment income above the median, and that's for full-time, full-year workers. And the 4 are registered nurses, elementary school teachers, senior managers in both the public and private sector, and financial auditors. All of the rest are rather lower paid occupations. And we can also look at the gender breakdown for those occupations, and the majority of the occupations are dominated by women. You can see early childhood educators, administrative assistants, registered nurses, all over 90% women. At the bottom, we see a number of the trades where there's a very low representation of women. And I found it interesting that senior managers in the public and private sector, really only 30% are women. I think there's some progress being made in that regard, but it's still a long way from equity. You can look at younger cohorts. Here, the 25 to 34-year-old, and women have made fairly significant strides in moving into these occupations. You can see young veterinarians are 83% women, 70% of optometrists are women, 65% of biologists, and on down the list. And the list includes architects, dentists, even specialists in survey now, getting up to about half of that young surgeons are in fact women. And it's interesting to compare this young group, essentially young millennials for the most part, with their parents' generation, 55 to 64-year-olds. And you can see the big difference in terms of the representation of women in these occupations. Between the two generations, there's been a 15 to 20% point increase when you compare the younger generations with their parents' generation. For example, surgeons, only 21% of surgeons 55 to 64 were women, and now nearly half are women. Going back to the TEER classification system that I mentioned, we can look at the distribution of jobs. How many jobs require each of those tiers? You can see there are 2.3 million jobs that are management type jobs. At the other extreme, you can see there are 3.3 million jobs that don't require any formal education, and another 3.3 million that require simply a high school. So overall, 1/3 of all the jobs in the country don't require any post-secondary education. Next, we can look at place of work, something that's certainly been impacted during the pandemic. Overall, we can see at census time, again, just reminding you, in May of 2021, 1/4 of the workforce were working primarily from home. 63% were still going into the office or factory on a regular basis. 13% had no fixed address, moved around from day to day. And there were nearly 60,000 people who worked outside Canada. For example, crossing the border daily from Windsor to Detroit or from Toronto to Buffalo. And if we look at the working at home by age, we can see virtually all age groups were affected. All showed fairly big increases from 2016. The one exception perhaps are young workers. Those workers are mostly in industries, many working part-time in the retail, fast food industries, and not amenable their jobs to be done from home. We look at the working at home levels by industry. We see, not surprisingly, some big differences. Jobs in management, professional jobs, finance and insurance, information industry, all had more than half of the workforce working from home. At the bottom end, jobs in healthcare, transportation, construction, manufacturing, really not amenable to working at home, and only about 10% of the jobs were people working from home. And what that means is that if we look across the country, very different levels of working at home in the various metropolitan areas. Ottawa-Gatineau, with its large public service, had 40% of people working from home at the time of the census. Toronto, 35%. At the other extreme, places like Kamloops, Saguenay, Red Deer, Drummondville have an industrial structure that really is not amenable to jobs working from home, and their numbers are down around 10 to 15%. We can look at what's happened since the census. The labor force survey, the monthly labor force survey, actually tracks the population working from home on a monthly basis. And you can see here, back at the height of the pandemic in April 2020, labor force showed over 40% of people working from home. That's come down, and particularly it's come down since the census was taken in May of 2021. Levels in the labor force survey are a little bit different than the census. They're measured differently, but I think the trend is what's important. And you can see a couple of weeks ago, when the labor force reported for November, 15.6% of the workforce were working from home. And we can see how the hybrid work, people going into the office 2 or 3 days a week, increasing, getting up to 10%. And I think what we're going to see in the new year is the numbers working from home totally, that 15% is likely going to decline a fair bit more, and hybrid work is going to increase. I suspect, for example, here in the Ottawa-Gatineau area where I live, the public service will see a change from basically allowing everyone to decide whether or not they go into the office at all to probably a mandatory 2 to 3 day period in the office. We'll see, but I expect to see that. What about the returns to education? Well, this chart shows the level of employment income, the median employment income, and you can see, not surprisingly, a pretty strong relationship. Earned doctorates have a median income of $110,000, bachelor's degrees around $78,000. Overall, all jobs are at $63,600. And those jobs that don't require any kind of certificate or diploma, $43,000. High school diploma required, $51,000. So you can see the big difference. I found it interesting that the apprenticeship certificates had an income of $70,000, $10,000 higher than a college college diploma, and a little bit lower than a bachelor's diploma at $78,000. And if we look at the STEM fields of study, those jobs related to STEM, engineering, education, math, science, I guess the education teaching is not really a STEM, but it also is a high-paying, relatively high-paying job above the median, while most of the other non-STEM related fields in business, trade, social, healthcare were below. Of course, there's lots of variation within these. These are very, very broad categories. And in fact, we can look at individual, very detailed occupations. The judges stand out, $300,000 median income, petroleum engineers, managers in the resource sector, specialists in medicine, surgery, commissioned police officers, for example, all at the top of the list. Interesting, at the bottom, senior managers in the public and private sector at $120,000 median income. Now we'll look at 3 groups, how well they're doing in education, what kinds of education credentials they have, and what this means in terms of their labor force performance. First of all, probably most of you know, immigrants are fairly highly educated, much more so than the Canadian-born population. You can see here at all levels, at the bachelor's and above, there are more immigrants compared to the Canadian-born, and particularly high at the high end of medical degrees, master's degrees, and doctorates, where we're getting to the point where nearly half of the workforce in those areas are made up of immigrants. It's also interesting to look at where immigrants obtain their highest level of education. Overall, post-secondary certificates from immigrants are obtained in Canada at a 46% level. So nearly half of immigrants obtaining their highest post-secondary degree in Canada, a little bit higher for college and apprenticeship, a little bit lower for bachelors, a little bit over a third of all bachelor's degrees were earned in Canada. And just for comparison, interesting to look at the Canadian-born and where they study, and you can see that at the earned doctorate level, about 1 in 5 actually get their degrees outside of Canada. So how do things look in terms of the labor force? You can see here that non-immigrants have a higher employment rate, or immigrants a lower employment rate compared to non-immigrants, slightly even lower for recent immigrants. If you look at unemployment, basically the same story. Immigrants higher unemployment, and recent immigrants slightly even higher. Interesting to look at the immigrant population and see the extent to which they might be classified as being overqualified. And we can do this by going back to that TEER classification system. Here I've shown you the university educated population who are working in jobs that require only high school or less. And you can see that overall in the population, 12% of the population are what might be termed overqualified with university degrees, but much higher, nearly double the rate for immigrants compared to non-immigrants, 16% compared to 8%. And if we look at period of immigration, we can see that those immigrants who have arrived more recently have particularly high levels of being overqualified. And one of the reasons for that, we can see on this chart, which I actually borrowed from StatsCan, and modified it a bit because I'm looking at the 25 to 54-year-old age group. And by the way, I use that age range because it allows for a little bit of a control on the age differences, and there are major differences in age between immigrants and the Canadian-born. But you can see here the Canadian-born population, about 8.6% being overqualified. Immigrants as a whole, a little higher, about 10%. But if you look, the 10% refers to immigrants who actually obtained their highest level of education in Canada. But if you look at immigrants who actually obtain their highest levels outside of Canada, you can see double the numbers, up in the 20% or so, a little bit higher for men than for women. And of course, what's underneath this is the big issue of credential recognition. Immigrants have a hard time getting their credentials recognized here in Canada, and as a result, are working in jobs for which they have much, much higher qualifications. What do the racialized groups look like? Basically, much the same pattern as we saw in immigration. These are the 10 groups, and I'm showing the percent with a post-secondary education, both in 2006 and in 2021. And you can see all groups, with the exception of the Southeast Asian group, have employment level, have post-secondary degree levels above the reference group, which I've taken as the population who are not members of one of the racialized groups. And you can see the changes for some groups, some substantial changes between 2006 and 2021. Even the lowest group, that South Asian group, has certainly changed a fair bit. In terms of the labor force, again, reflecting what we saw in immigration, the employment rate for the racialized groups being lower and the unemployment rates being higher. And we can look at the individual groups and we can see in terms of the employment rate, only the Filipino group had an employment rate higher than the reference group. All other groups had lower employment rates. Overall, the racialized groups combined had an employment rate of 75% compared to 80%. And if we look at the unemployment, basically the same situation, only the Filipino group stands out as having a lower unemployment rate. All of the other groups have unemployment rates higher than our reference group. And if we look at gender, what are the gender differences in employment rates? We can see for men, there are actually 3 groups that have employment rates higher than our reference group. But for women, only the Filipino group is higher than our reference group. And it's interesting if you look down, except perhaps for the lowest employment level for women in West Asian, all of the other groups are pretty similar and have employment rates in and around 65 to 75%. Also interesting to compare the racialized groups by breaking them out into immigrants and the second or higher generations. Here we can see the employment, we're looking at unemployment rates here. We can see the unemployment rate for all groups except the Filipino group being higher than the reference group. We saw that basically in the total before. And in the Canadian born, a bit of a different situation. We can see the Chinese and Japanese racialized groups having unemployment lower for the Canadian born compared to the immigrants. All others are mostly lower with the exception of 2 groups, the Black and the Latin American groups. Actually, the Canadian born unemployment is higher than the immigrant unemployment. And I think one of the possible reasons for that is that the mix within the Black and the Latin American groups, these are very heterogeneous groups, are likely different when one compares the immigrants to the Canadian born. And that may be a result of the higher numbers in the Canadian born. Finally, a look at the Indigenous population. The Indigenous population numbers about 2 million in the country, 5% of Canada's population, and we can look at their education levels. I don't think it's a surprise. For long-term, the Indigenous population have lower levels of education. Here we look at the population who have completed high school or got on to higher levels, 79% for the Indigenous population versus 92% for the non-Indigenous population. And we break it up by the type of Indigenous person, those living on reserve, and the Inuk population living in Inuit communities have particularly low levels of high school completion. Higher numbers for the First Nations off reserve and the Métis, but still a bit lower than the non-Indigenous population. And if we look at the higher end, the population that's gone on to a post-secondary degree or diploma, again, we see the big differences and particularly low levels for the on-reserve and the Inuk populations. Finally, looking at the labor force, the employment rates for the Indigenous population lower than the non-Indigenous, 65% compared to close to 80%. And again, being lowest for First Nations on reserve, a little bit higher for Inuk, and a little bit higher for the Métis and the First Nations off reserve. Métis approaching the employment rate of the non-Indigenous population. And in terms of unemployment, same picture, much higher unemployment levels for our Indigenous population, and particularly high for the on-reserve and Inuk populations. So that completes the quick look we've had at data. It's a very rich source of data that's available, and we've only touched on some of the highlights. There was some other data released in the last couple of weeks. Commuting data, I didn't touch on the commuting data. The commuting data, of course, refers to May of 2021 during the pandemic. And so I think we need to be careful in interpreting the results of the commuting data. We have data on what people speak in terms of languages at workplaces, and we have new data on instruction in the minority official language. And this allows for a calculation of who is entitled to receive minority official language education across the various provinces. We're now working on our 2023 demo stats. We're going to be shifting in that release to the 2021 census geography. We'll be able to incorporate a fair bit of the results from the 2021 census. But the base is still somewhat tied to 2016, because the big piece we're missing is the estimates of undercount in the census, which allow us to adjust the data. And the adjustment for this census may be a bit bigger than it has been in the past, because with the pandemic, it was particularly difficult, and the much lower enumeration rates, particularly in Northern Canada on reserves and in other areas. So we're going to really have to make those adjustments. And unfortunately, we won't be able to do that until 2024, as the results of the undercount estimates from StatsCan won't be out until sometime later in 2023. We will be completing our release of Census Plus in Envision, and then we'll be starting our work on completely moving demostats over, particularly paying attention to the data quality issues. We're going to have a look at PRISM. Are there new types of communities that we should build into our PRISM segmentation system? And the timing of all of that depends again on the release of the undercount, but we'll be able to convert everything over by our 2024 release. So with that, hopefully giving you some insights, hopefully he's indicated some of the richness of the data we have. And I think we still have a little bit of time for questions, so I'll turn it back to Grant.
Thank you very much, Doug, for another fantastic presentation, and for all the presentations you've done across each of these census releases. So as Doug mentioned, we have some time for questions now, so we'll go through the first set of questions. Doug, first one for you. Are there any variables in the census regarding current post-secondary enrollment rather than degree attainment?
Well, there is a question, I think, as I mentioned, on attendance at school in the last 12 months. And if you were to combine that with the current level, so for example, if you look at someone whose current level was high school and they were attending school, you could infer that they're in some type of post-secondary education. So it's not a direct measure, but I think you could get at it indirectly by combining those two variables.
Okay, great. Another one here. Based on the current population, is Canada likely to see more labor shortages with a slowing birth rate?
Well, the labor shortages, I think, are here certainly now. And as I reported in an earlier presentation, I mean, the labor shortages are mainly due to our low fertility rate, despite the level of immigration. The immigration numbers are certainly going to help grow our labor force, particularly the very high targets that the government has set. Still, there will be a pull down for a number of years, another 5 or 10 years, because of aging. That'll get balanced a little bit by the immigrant population. And there are two other groups, certainly our Indigenous population. If we can make more progress on training the Indigenous population, that can provide a boost to our labor market. And I think there's some hope that with the new programs on child support and lowering the costs of childcare, perhaps more women can enter the labor force who haven't been able to up to now. So there are a number of initiatives, government policies underway to try and address what is sort of inherent in an aging labor force.
Great, thank you. a statement followed by a question. We saw a huge drop in numbers for the 0 legislative and senior management category for occupations across Canada. Was this related to the reclassification of occupations to show education level?
I'm not sure when you say there was a big decline, whether that decline, I did not, and you should not compare 2020 with 2015 or 21 with 2016 on the net code for exactly the reason the questioner mentioned. I don't think I did that. I think my comparison was between 2 generations. So the same coding structure was used for both generations. So I think if that's the chart they're pointing to, that wasn't affected by the coding. That's a real change.